Welcome to the debate. Our focus today is on, one of the most significant paradigm shifts in how we understand human sexual response. We're moving decisively away from those older, sort of purely mechanistic, genital-focused models towards these modern neuropsychological frameworks.
Right. And that shift, really acknowledging the brain as the most important sex organ, it's been revolutionary. It kind of crystallized with the development of the dual control model, the DCM, which frames sexual response as this delicate balance between two systems, the sexual excitation system, the accelerator, and the sexual inhibition system, which acts as the brakes.
Exactly, and the source material makes it pretty clear that applying this DCM has led to a really crucial insight. Problems in sexual function, they usually stem not from a weak accelerator, but from brakes that are just far too sensitive or maybe constantly engaged. So this forces us to define our practical priorities, doesn't it? The central question we need to debate today is this. Is successful sexual well-being and therapeutic progress primarily achieved by focusing on removing the sexual inhibition system, the brakes, or is it, mandatory to focus just as much on optimizing the conditions for the sexual excitation system, the accelerator, to really function effectively?
And I suppose I'll be arguing that emphasizing the brakes over the accelerator fundamentally misrepresents the dynamic complexity that's required for creating genuine pleasure and, importantly, sustained motivation.
Okay. Well, I recognize the importance of the accelerator, naturally, but my core position is that the real revolution in sexual science is this realization that the primary barrier to pleasure is the internal negative context, the brakes, not simply a lack of stimulation. The data we see consistently shows that the issues bringing people into clinical settings are these structural inhibitions: stress, anxiety, unresolved trauma, body shame, maybe relationship conflict.
And those are undeniably powerful factors, yes. They absolutely have to be addressed.
Well, I'd argue they are the dominant factors. They act as the ultimate gatekeeper. We know, as we said, that sex is more a brain process than a genital process. Just consider the neuropsychological evidence for a moment. People with spinal cord injuries, they can learn to experience orgasm by essentially training their brains to redirect their response. Now, that proves the brain is the ultimate locus of control, right? So if the inhibition system is a brain process dedicated to threat assessment, then the priority for therapeutic leverage must be removing those brakes, reducing stress, establishing relational safety. Because if you can't bypass the brain's protective instinct, frankly, no amount of acceleration matters.
See, that line of reasoning, it worries me a bit, because it frames sexual well-being as primarily the absence of something bad rather than the presence of something good. My position is that the DSCM inherently emphasizes a balance, and ignoring the needs of the excitation system, the accelerator, it misrepresents the really complex role of context in creating pleasure, not just in avoiding a threat.
But doesn't the absence of threat create the necessary context?
It creates maybe a neutral starting point, but context is surely more than just neutrality. The material itself defines arousal as the result of balancing both systems, and crucially, this modern concept of responsive desire shows that sexual motivation often arises from the context, meaning the environment has to actively engage the accelerator first, often before inhibition can even really be assessed. We know the brain interprets incoming stimuli based on its immediate emotional state. We're talking about the nucleus accumbens shell, the brain's sort of approach avoidance center, shifting its interpretation from, say, threat avoidance when stressed to curiosity approach when relaxed or playful. So while the absence of stress, releasing the brakes, is helpful, absolutely, you still need the active input, the on switch, that triggers curiosity or approach behavior. And that input is the accelerator.
I would suggest, though, that defining safety is defining the context. If we look at the prerequisite conditions mentioned in the source material, things like external context, a locked door, safe environment, or internal context like low stress, these are fundamentally factors that reduce inhibition. They take the foot off the brake. Without the brakes released, all stimulation is subject to this negative filtering. So the functional switch isn't the stimulation itself, it's the brain's interpretation of that stimulation, and that's controlled by the inhibition system. Think about the example of tickling. It's perfect here. The exact same physical sensation is either fun or infuriating, depending entirely on the context of safety, which means the brakes being off.
Okay, I absolutely acknowledge that relational safety and removing shame are crucial targets for addressing the brakes. They're non-negotiable foundations, sure. But I challenge the idea that achieving safety automatically suffices for sexual well-being. Responsive desire, as I said, requires context to provide the stimulus for motivation, and that stimulus is an active factor. The source material, for instance, lists partner attentiveness as a key contextual factor. Now, is attentiveness the removal of a threat, or is it an active invitation that triggers the accelerator system? I would argue strongly that it's a positive initiating factor. It's necessary for approach behavior. The course shift needs both the offs removed and the ons present, and I'd argue prioritized.
Well, I might classify partner attentiveness differently. I'd see it as a core component of vulnerability management, which is ultimately an inhibitory process. Think about it. If the relationship is fraught, attentiveness can feel like surveillance or pressure, right? It triggers the brakes. If the relationship feels secure, if the brakes are released, then attentiveness is correctly interpreted as a cue for intimacy. So the action is less about directly initiating the accelerator and more about reassuring the security system, the brakes, that the environment is safe for intimacy to potentially occur.
But this intense focus on safety alone, it risks creating a scenario where we're only teaching people how not to avoid sex rather than how to actively seek pleasure. And maybe we should look at the historical models here for a second. When Helen Singer Kaplan introduced her triphasic model, desire, arousal, orgasm, she was correcting a huge omission by Masters and Johnson.
And what was that specific omission?
Well, Masters and Johnson overlooked desire completely because their studies focused solely on performance and physical response. Their model worked fine, I suppose, for people who are already motivated, but it failed those who lacked that internal wanting. This historical blind spot, it tells us that motivation, the core function of the accelerator, is often the critical missing link. Responsive desire is the modern framework, yes, but the underlying requirement hasn't really changed. Modern practice must ensure the context actively fosters sexual wanting. That's the accelerator side, not just performance simply because fear is absent.
That's a strong historical link, I grant you. But let me try and reframe it through the lens of the DCM. Kaplan's focus on desire was necessary then, absolutely, but the DCM, and specifically Rosemary Bassen's responsive desire model, refines this. It explains that motivation often arises from the context and often after arousal begins, not always before. So the motivation to continue, the wanting, can be secondary. And what defines whether that initial spark of stimulation even registers as potential arousal? It's the absence of inhibition. If the brakes are slammed on due to chronic stress, trauma, or even just simple distraction, no amount of initial wanting or external stimulation is going to sustain the experience. The inhibition system acts as the ultimate energy drain. It overrides the accelerator practically every single time. So it has to be the highest leverage point.
I'm still concerned that line of reasoning implies that, once all your historical trauma is magically resolved, you'll automatically know what turns you on. And it's simply not true for many people.
Okay? You've stopped fearing sex, maybe, but that doesn't automatically mean you possess the self-knowledge to activate genuine pleasure.
It means you have the opportunity for pleasure, which is often the most difficult hurdle for people seeking help. The clinical evidence really does support my position here, and we see this reflected directly in the practical takeaways discussed in the material itself.
Let's look at that practical list then. The personal accelerators and brakes? Okay. The material explicitly states that real progress often comes from removing the brakes. Now, this isn't just a theoretical suggestion. It's presented as an empirical observation of where the therapeutic leverage is greatest. If our primary focus is on treating dysfunction, we have to prioritize the system that's most often responsible for that dysfunction.
But I'd suggest that observation might be strongly rooted in the specific clinical population being studied. People who seek therapy are presenting precisely because they have chronic, often overwhelming inhibition issues. So, of course, removing the brakes will yield the greatest improvement in that specific group. But for general sexual health, for proactive well-being, for moving beyond just neutrality, the DCM demands treating both systems as crucial. And this is really where the balance of the DCEM comes into play, I think. If someone resolves their shame and anxiety, their major structural breaks are removed, great. But if they never take the time to actually identify their personal accelerators, what sparks curiosity, imagination, specific sensory inputs, whatever it might be, they risk getting stuck in a state of just safe neutrality.
And I agree that safe neutrality is not the ultimate goal. Of course not.
But it's precisely what you risk if you over-prioritize inhibition removal. If the individual doesn't identify accelerators like, say, novelty, or specific romantic fantasy, or playful risk, they can't actively curate a context that moves the brain into an approach state. Removing the negatives gives you permission, maybe, but identifying and activating the positives gives you direction and desire. The work has to be dual.
I hear you arguing that the work is dual, but I still maintain the mechanism is often sequential. If the brain is interpreting all stimuli through this lens of safety, then creating that safe baseline, removing the brakes, is the essential first action that allows the accelerator to be interpreted as pleasurable rather than neutral or even threatening. We've moved past seeing the body as just some simple mechanical device. We now see the brain, correctly I think, as a kind of security system that usually needs to be disengaged first.
And I agree the security system must be deactivated, absolutely. But once the security system is off, you still need to decide what to invite into the space. If the emphasis remains solely on safety, we risk creating a very conservative, maybe even limited approach to pleasure. The accelerator is the system of curiosity, novelty, exploration, even a little risk sometimes. We have to actively teach people how to optimize their internal and external world for the approach signal, and that's purely the domain of the accelerator. For example, if I tell someone they need to remove the brake of distraction from work, that's great, necessary even. But they also probably need to strategically introduce the accelerator of, say, sensory focus or structured anticipation, which are proactive, positive inputs.
Okay, I do see the strategic necessity of those positive inputs. But when we look at why people struggle repeatedly again and again, it's because stress and shame are constantly, almost automatically pulling that emergency brake. Even if the accelerator is firing, the brakes are essentially built to override it in threatening situations. It's an energy expenditure issue too. Dealing with the primary stressor, the brake, frees up cognitive and emotional resources far more effectively, I believe, than trying to push the gas pedal harder while constantly fighting that internal resistance.
And yet, if we only focus on reducing negative energy, we might fail entirely to cultivate positive energy. The DCM teaches us that both systems compete for attention, for resources. If the environment just becomes routine, boring, well, the lack of novelty can act as a kind of quiet inhibitor, sure. But more crucially, the absence of active acceleration leads to fading interest over time. This becomes a problem of optimization, not just mitigation of threats.
So, to summarize my position, the real paradigm shift revealed by the DCM is that inhibition, stress, shame, lack of safety, is the fundamental bottleneck for most people experiencing difficulties. Sexual well-being is a deep neuropsychological process, and therefore, prioritizing the mitigation, the removal of the sexual inhibition system provides the greatest therapeutic leverage. It addresses the most common and structurally resistant struggles we see clinically.
And my summary is that while the brakes must certainly be addressed, often as a prerequisite, the DCM's core insight for me is that pleasure is actively constructed by the brain, depending on complex internal and external conditions. Moving beyond merely not being inhibited towards genuine pleasure and responsive desire requires the active creation of positive contexts. That means the optimization of the accelerator to foster curiosity, approach behavior, and that sustained wanting.
Well, this discussion certainly reinforces that the science of sexual responses move far beyond simple mechanics. It really necessitates a truly nuanced view of safety, context, and that essential dynamic balance of the two systems outlined in the dual control model. Thank you for illuminating the necessity of prioritizing acceleration, even as I maintain that lifting the brakes provides the foundational solution for most people seeking help.